So now we are going to be joined shortly with Chris Hayes, who's the host of All In with Chris Hayes on MSNBC. Specifically chose to talk to him about his book that he wrote in 2017, a Colony in a Nation, which is right here. So basically, I read this book recently, and I was very fascinated by it. So I decided to reach out to his team to see if he's available, and he was. So we're happy to have him soon. He'll be on right at 5:30. Just to give you guys some context, a colony in a nation is a term that Richard Nixon used when he was running for election in the 60s, late 60s. Basically, he was trying to, pander to the African American community, saying, "We don't want you guys to be a colony in a nation. You want you guys to be included in the American system." Obviously, Richard Nixon has his critiques on his records on race and police and racial injustice and law and order and all that. So we'll be sure to talk to Chris Hayes about that once he comes on. I believe he'll be on in a few seconds, actually. I see his name popping up right now. All right. So if we have him, let's unmute our guest, Chris Hayes of MSNBC. Hi, Chris. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
You bet.
Yeah. So I see we have you until about 5:50, I believe. So.
Yep.
All right, awesome. So I did a little introduction about you already in your book in the term "A Colony in a Nation." So I believe you wrote this in 2017, right? And it was re-released in 2018 with an edition about Trump. Would you want to address the re-release and kind of why you did that?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote it. I mostly wrote it in 2016. Came out in 2017. I think Donald Trump is mentioned maybe once in the whole book because I was sort of not that focused on him in what I was writing with the book. And then he was elected, and the year later, the paperback, it was pretty clear to me that he was a culmination of everything I talked about in the book, specifically about the rhetoric of law and order. I think it's not an accident that the two Republican presidents who have most banged on the term law and order in the last 60 years have been the two most implicated in outright crime. Richard Nixon, of course, law and order was a key to his 68 run when he defeated Humphrey, and he, it's pretty clear that he was a omnidirectional criminal surrounded by criminals who committed various felonies and was ultimately chased out of the White House for it. Donald Trump then sort of revived the term, and anytime anyone in his inner circle has been committed or convicted of crimes, he said it's a witch hunt or that they're dirty cops or it's bad, but he also thinks that someone that defaces a statue should get 10 years. And to me, it's not hypocrisy so much as it's actually a coherent worldview about what law and order means, which is that it's not really about the law. It's about order. It's about maintaining a certain social order, and that certain social order is adjacent to or coterminous with a certain social hierarchy. Some people are on top, other people are on bottom, and the threat to law and order is a threat to the hierarchy, much more than it's actually about threat to lawfulness or commissions of crimes. I mean, the president's own henchman is, confessed to being involved in a criminal scheme directed by the president. Is obviously his former campaign manager and his senior advisor and his first national security advisor, and on and on and on. He's as more surrounded by criminals in the sort of textbook sense than any president since Nixon. And yet, like Nixon, has leaned very heavily on this idea. And I think at a certain point, you have to accept that it's not really about the law. It's not about crime as we think about it. It's about maintaining a certain social order.
Yeah, so the difference I get when I read your book, Chris, Colony in a Nation, is it sounds like that term was kind of used to invite the Black community into America. Nixon kind of realized that they were seeing themselves as others, and he wanted to kind of invite them into the conversation. Am I reading that right? And how do you think Trump's doing with the Black, in terms of trying to get Black voters?
Well, what I think is interesting is that Nixon's just much more rhetorically deft than Trump was. I mean, the thing to remember about 68 is that you had the Democrat, you had Nixon, and then you had George Wallace. And Wallace was running as, he was also running on law and order. It's actually a term he used a lot. He was the explicit sort of white nationalist, segregationist, hard right identity candidate in that race. And so Nixon was always positioning himself between the two as a kind of reasonable middle. And you're right, in the context of the speech that he gives in Miami in '68, it's about basically saying that, basically black people want the same things white people want. They want to sort of be embedded in the social fabric of the nation and the social contract. They don't want to be a, quote, a colony in a nation. Trump is much worse at this rhetorically. I mean, he's just much, doesn't have the sort of basic rhetorical gifts that Nixon had. And I think has been much blunter about it. But I would also say this, there were some, I think, effective moments in the Republican National Convention in carrying this message. And the reason that I think Nixon landed upon it, and the reason that Trump has tried to use it, and the reason that you see really interesting cross-pressured polling around policing and crime and defunding the police and reforming the police in African-American communities, is that it's not like there's a homogeneous view among African Americans, obviously, in this country on a bunch of these issues. A. B, a certain kind of consensus view of the uses of public space are necessary in any community, right? Like the negotiation of public space, which is a huge part of what we have police do, negotiate public space, right? They resolve disputes about public space. Those conflicts are endemic to democratic life. And there are going to be different community standards for dealing with them in different environments, but everybody has that. Like, I don't think there's anyone who has, say, a person with severe substance or mental illness issues urinating on their door, who's like, this is great. Like that, you know, there's a certain degree to which there's a lot wrong in that picture. I mean, from a sort of care empathy standpoint, like that's a person that needs treatment, that's a person who needs housing, that's a person who needs a lot of things. But from that kind of like things are unraveling order sense, I don't think that's a distinct view among some sect of reactionaries or white folks. There is some universal appeal to the general invocation. And I think that's why it was effective for Nixon. I think it's why it's an effective thing to talk about, even though Trump does it very clumsily.
Yeah. So I like the fact that you talk about so I wanted to just mention that your book was the first book I bought at an independent bookstore during the coronavirus pandemic when things started loosening up. So that's the reason why I came across it. The reason why I like your book so much is because you're just so honest about the system and how it's designed for people like you know, white men. But it seems like now with George Floyd, like people are finally getting it. What do you think that is, that they're finally getting it now and not 6 years ago when Michael Brown was killed?
You know, I think one of the arguments the book makes is that actually in some ways the system's sort of designed to keep these spaces separate, right? So all sorts of different layers of residential and housing segregation create segregation that literally has the explicit goal, even if never quite enunciated, of keeping people separate, of keeping black neighborhoods and white neighborhoods separate, good neighborhoods and bad neighborhoods separate. And that the idea is that like the police essentially patrol the boundaries between them. And because of that, I think there's just a lot of out of sight, out of mind. It's particularly true, interestingly enough, I think, in the universe in which, you know, crime rose tremendous amounts between, say, 1968 and 1992, and then has fallen quite dramatically since 92, even though there's been sort of an uptick in 2014, a decline, and now an uptick back in 2020. All of that means, I think, that there's a real sort of out of sight, out of mind mentality that certain relatively affluent, predominantly white, but not exclusively, residents of relatively economically dynamic metro areas can have about what's going on with the police. Like, I don't know, it's not happening to me. Like, I don't know, maybe I see a police officer once in a while in a cruiser in my neighborhood. I wave hi, they wave back. That's about it. Like, people's first person experience is just such worlds different. Universe is different. And so I think that's a big part of it. People need to sort of read and listen and extend their understanding of what's happening outside their own personal experience. And I think that the Black Lives Matter movement has been really effective in doing that. I think the availability of iPhone, you know, cell phone video has been really important in that. You know, one of the big reckoning moments of my youth, and I guess it was 1992, Rodney King, or 91, 92, and Rodney King was, again, you know, due to video. And at that time, that was a fairly like expensive and rare piece of equipment for someone to be hanging out on their porch filming. So I think the combination of technology and this very powerful and potent organized social movement have really expanded some of the kind of empathetic faculties of a lot of white folks. It's not enough, because I think that, the rubber hits the road on things like school desegregation and housing desegregation, and there's still a lot of folks showing up at the community board meeting to oppose those things. That's a real next hurdle. But I do think that there has been real progress made in people's, at least, perspective on all this.
Well, it's crazy to think about the death of Michael Brown was only 6 years ago. So is there anything else you can attribute to the difference between then and now, 6 years ago? I mean, again, I just feel like with Michael Brown's death, there just wasn't this, coming together there is with George Floyd. Is it just the video that you think did it, or is it anything else?
I think the video plays a huge, I think the video and the specific cruelty of that, the sadism and the cruelty involved in the video. I think, social progress very often is extremely nonlinear. It's not like painting a fence where like you're going and it's like, oh, well, we're 30% of the way there now, we're 70% of the way. It's much more like prying a stuck lid off a jar, where you're working on it for 3 minutes and then it pops off. So there's some sort of, I think, difficult to predict nature in when these things happen and when they don't. I also think that like the explicit bigotry of the President of the United States and the hardship, frustration, and built up anger of 8 weeks of lockdown amidst a pandemic that was disproportionately killing Black and Latinx folks. I think like all of that came together in a lot of ways as well. But I think part of it is like, look, I think about prohibition all the time, which in some ways is one of the most fascinating social movements because it was a kind of catastrophic success. But it also took them, it took them 60 years, 70 years. And there were lots of periods where they were receding and viewed as cranks and not winning until they did, and so there's a nonlinearity to all this that I think just confounds a lot of our ability to make sense of it. Emmett Till's a great example too. Like, Emmett Till was this incredibly, indisputably sort of catalyzing moment. And there had been literally dozens of young Black men who met his fate. And part of it was that the mom was from the North and he was on a trip to the South and came back up to the North, and the open casket and all of those aspects to it. But again, there's almost a kind of unanswerable question about which moment seizes.
That's a good answer. Also, reading your book, I've read that it seems like there was just the Ferguson Police Department was just wrought with like issues, and it seems like I've read a little bit of reporting on that with Kenosha too. So do you think these arguments with the these problematic police departments strengthen or hurt the movement overall for reform?
Well, I think the movement for reform is strong. The problem is like what reform looks like. In some ways, the persistence of places that continue to allow bad actors and bad practices even after being reformed is part of what I think has pushed people towards a kind of more abolitionist or defund mentality, which is these are institutions incapable of reform. I don't quite go that far myself. Like, I do think there are examples of successful reform efforts. I think like Newark, New Jersey has been a really interesting one that combines a bunch of things, a consent decree, federal oversight, a fairly radical mayor and Ross Baraka, an extremely diverse police force that largely lives in the community. Like, there's a bunch of things there. But the accountability issues and the persistence of wrongdoing are really tough problems to solve. And particularly when you have things as, Ferguson was a particularly corrupt, endemic situation where they were literally acting as revenue collectors for the city. All those traffic tickets and summonses were producing revenue at a scale that like the town needed to run. I don't think that's a lot of times police misconduct isn't directly connected in such a dollars and cents way as it is in Ferguson. It has more to do with the kind of like um, the embedded lack of accountability for bad cops. And it's interesting to me when people talk about like bad apples, but as in like, well, it was just bad apples, and like the entire point of the cliche is that a bad apple spoils the bunch. Like literally, apples rot, and the chemical they release when rotting accelerates the rotting of the other apples in the barrel. So yes, that is the problem, and I don't think no reform effort will be successful without dealing with that.
So I also wanted to ask you about kind of some of the themes that you mentioned earlier, like law and order. One of the ones I thought was really interesting was a white fear concept. Do you want to explain that or any other themes that you have in your book that are
I mean, I
relevant
think
now?
there's a specific kind of fear among, I mean, the first sentence written about one of the first sentences written of white people encountering North America. Uh, the United States proper is the Jamestown settlement, where the captain of the ship, I think the first entry of his diary is, "We were set upon by the savages." Like the first moment of encounter, right, is uh, these people are subhuman. They're different from us. They're unchristian. They are not our equals, and also they are violent, and they are besetting us, and we need to conquer them. And the sort of bunker mentality that comes with that, the combination of these sort of twin things together, right? Relative dominance and power, like they had weapons that the indigenous peoples they were encountering did not. They brought diseases that killed those people, with a kind of bunkered fear mentality. Those two things are so toxic when put together. But much of the story of America can be told that way. I mean, the settling of the frontier, the sort of settler expansion of the entire country, the entire system of slavery throughout the Old South, which relied upon, what, 10 white people on a plantation holding violent dominion over 70 slaves, right? The numbers were crazy, right? It was this pyramid where, and as I write in the book, I mean, people were, Southern papers were constantly full of, these lurid tales of slave revolts and constant fear of slave revolt. So what I talk about in white fear is a particular kind of fear that comes from being at a point of relative power or privilege in a social order and fearing that it will come apart and you will end up on the bottom. And, that is a very powerful force historically in American politics.
And it's fair to say that Donald Trump and his allies kind of play up that fear, right?
I mean, I think that has been the central message of Trumpism, right? I mean, that is the central message is, you are no longer at the top of the heap. And I will restore you to the top of the heap, even in a just symbolic, rhetorical way. These ungrateful black athletes, these sneering, whiny women law professors who pretend that they're Native American, like quote Pocahontas, these Hollywood elites that look down, like these Antifa anarchists, these Black Lives Matter savages, like all of these forces that are going to undo your primacy in the social order. I am there for you. And one of the people at the RNC said he's the bodyguard of Western civilization, which is a hilarious formation in a million ways, just because he couldn't be anyone's bodyguard. But and I don't just mean that because of his current illness. I just mean in general. But that is explicitly the core of the whole appeal. Like, you have been pushed off center from the social order that used to center you, and I will restore you to the center. That's the pitch.
I feel like a lot of the times I've heard a lot of white people specifically say, "What can I do to, what can I do? What can they ask specifically minorities? What can I do to make things better?" What do you say to those people? I mean, you seem to just completely understand your privilege again in the situation around the systems. How do you help those people who don't get that?
I think a big part is like be a good local citizen. So that means like get involved in local prosecutors races where your vote can have a huge effect because those not many people vote in them. Does your local city council person vote for a budget that reflects your values, right? That reflects investing in things like mental health services or emergency services that are non-police options to deal with folks that are in distress. And you know that's one really like specific creative thing. Oakland's been doing that. There's places in on the Pacific Northwest, a few towns that have tried this. Like Colorado is spearheading this, like reducing the scope of policing in a way where we say, look, a bunch of calls to police don't need to be handled by police. Who can we send that don't have guns, that aren't trained to think about violence and the thin blue line and protecting civilization, but are there to get people connected to what they need in times of distress or to ratchet down conflict that inevitably happens in public spaces. So getting involved locally is really important. A really important thing is do not be a defender of the status quo of housing and education segregation. You like there are meetings like there's meetings in my neighborhood. There was a women's shelter they were trying to build a few, several blocks away. There were some people that organized in opposition. There were more people who organized in favor. In our public school district, our district came up with a desegregation plan because the middle schools had gotten so segregated. And there were parents on both sides of that, and the parents on the side of desegregation won. And like we put together a good plan that is now like materially desegregating schooling in the catchment area. Like those local fights, so many times that's where the rubber hits the road. Like, are you going to be on the side of desegregating American life? That means desegregating housing and education primarily.
So I want to be respectful of your time. I think we only have 2 minutes with you, from what I understand. So I guess my question to you is just kind of, what's your reaction to all these people who are, reporting on this stuff? Like, do you think they're doing a good job, the media, the mainstream media, of reporting on these issues of police brutality and, the civil unrest and these protests?
I mean, it's hard. It's like one of those things whenever someone says the media, it's just like, it's such an enormous, it describes so many different things. I think there's been a lot of great reporting on this moment. There's been some bad reporting. I think, one of the things that's hard to do is like, there's a million stories to tell and which ones you tell, there were certain outlets on the right that wanted to just talk about, property damage or violence committed by people associated with the protests. And then I would sometimes see people on the left saying like any coverage of that is like complicit in police brutality or white supremacy. And I don't really agree with that. I think there's a question about like what the relative emphasis is. But like, the New York Times wrote an article about the Bronx storefronts in my home borough that got like broken into and ruined. And like, that's a real story about one of the things that happened. It's not the only story, and it would be wrong to be like, this is all that matters, right? Because like the story of the actual system, the images of police, what we have seen police do, not just in like the George Floyd videotape, right? But in the aftermath of that, the way they acted to the protests. I mean, again, the cell phone camera is useful. So I think all in all, like there's been a lot of great reporting. There's been a lot of bad reporting, but I do think there was an awareness of, I would say, through much of the national reporting about the sort of systemic context of all this that I think was probably more absent, say, 6 years earlier.
Right. I was gonna say, we're fortunate enough to have Ibram X. Kendi here in Boston University. He's all about anti-racism. He's launching initiative at Boston University. So yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the stuff you talk about in your book and the stuff you're talking about now is very, anti-racism is a big part of it. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think look, I mean, to me, it's even deeper than that. I mean, like genuine full equality, democratic equality is the sort of thing that we should be talking about. And like a society and a set of institutions that, smashes oppressive artificial hierarchies and gives everyone compassion and dignity and sort of full buy-in to our shared social contract is the goal. And that, the biggest obstacle in the history of America has been over race as the way that aspiration has been destroyed, particularly for African American people. But that same value is one that we can share beyond just the framework of race. I think it's something that sort of aspirationally share across all kinds of lines of difference, all kinds of different social hierarchies that are operating.
All right, one last question, if I can. Um, I guess I would just say, look at yourself 6 years ago when this book was published, and yourself now. Can you imagine that we would be in this position that we are in now with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and the reaction to it?
No, I mean, yes, in some ways, because it always seemed to me that there was a consciousness building. And then also I have to just say, there have been organizers and writers and thinkers and activists and teachers and all kinds of people working on this, day in, day out. And so again, the sort of explosion of the post George Floyd protest took me by some surprise, but the existence of a moment like that did not. When it happened was like, wow, but that something like that was coming was not surprising to me, I would say.
Right. Any final words you have or thoughts you have about just you want people to know about your book or about this issue or your reporting in general?
No, I mean, I think there's a lot of great books out there on the sort of, if you have my book and you look at the bibliography, there's sort of a recommended reading list. Ibram Kendi is one of the people, but there's a lot of amazing writing in this space, particularly over the last 5 years, that I think people should check out.
All right, Chris Hayes, you're from MSNBC. You're the host of All In with Chris Hayes. I believe you air at 8 o'clock tonight. 8 o'clock
Yep.
usually, right? So, okay, everyone tune in. Everyone listen to the podcast as well. What's your podcast again?
It's called Why Is This Happening? You can find it anywhere you get your podcasts.
All right. Thank you so much for your time again. And good luck with all the coverage tonight.
Thanks a lot. Be good. Bye.
All right, you too. Take care. All right, everyone. So that was our conversation with Chris Hayes. We just had him from MSNBC's All In. And before that, we had Pilar Melendez. She is of the Daily Beast to talk about her covering the George Floyd protests and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor. So this has been another installment of the SPJNE New England chapters Zoom series. Be sure to check us out next week. We're going to be having a discussion about The Dynasty, which is a book about the New England Patriots. So be sure to check out our Facebook page or our Twitter account or our YouTube page to learn more about that. Thanks again for tuning in, everyone. Have a good night. Enjoy the debate. Bye.